wildlife and civilization, cultural relationships of different kinds of people with wildlife and all that sort of thing. You've got to find a sponsor for each one of these things, and maybe sponsors want to sponsor what you're doing, maybe not. If not, how do you get it made? What should be made versus what is being made? How do you use what is being made? Can we make the perfect video? And if so, what is the perfect video? And if you've got a perfect video on wildlife and relationships with people, are people going to watch it? And can you get the money to do another one? And can you get it played? The bottom line, I think, is if people don't watch it, you can have the most perfect program. It takes all the knowledge of human beings for the last 6,000 years, squeeze it all into one video about relationships between people and wildlife in the natural world. But if nobody watches it because you did use the wrong style or use some words that turn people off, you haven't really got anywhere. So anyhow, it's these sorts of things that we've been struggling with down through the years, as well as evaluating films and getting people to talk about films. And at various times we've touched on this whole thing of wildlife film as a science topic, but in a humanities medium. And we've been faced over and over and over again with the dichotomy of wildlife biologists being trained in wildlife research, wildlife management, wildlife enforcement, but being totally separated in their work from what they watch on television at night or watch in the theater on the weekend, and seem to make no bridge whatsoever between what they do during the day and what they see going on television in the evening. So the wildlife biologists have been, I think, greatly at fault in not being involved. It's the media. Most of them hate the media. Most of them only reluctantly will get involved with the media, but almost all of them watch it at night. Never seem to make the connection between what the narrator might be talking about relative to wildlife versus their own role relative to wildlife. It's like they have two totally different personalities. The reason, I think, is it's not taught in wildlife books, it's not taught in wildlife classes, so you get biologists coming out constantly thinking these are two totally different things. And wildlife film doesn't have anything to do with my work as a wildlife biologist. Well, of course, it's idiotic. I tried very hard for the ethics panel that we had here yesterday to get the state agency in charge of wildlife to come and be involved. For about the 10th time in a row, they didn't even bother to come over from Helena or even from the office here in Missoula and be involved. On the other hand, you've got then filmmakers that may or may not be trained in filmmaking. Nowadays, anybody can go out and buy a camera and buy a bunch of videotape and be a wildlife filmmaker. Some are trained, some don't know any biology, some don't know a zip about filmmaking, and still tomorrow morning they're a wildlife filmmaker. And then you've got people in the humanities who might write poetry about wildlife, or might write, paint pictures about wildlife, and may or may not know anything about wildlife. But anyhow, we feel that somehow these two worlds have got to come together. We've been struggling for 19 years to try to get the two professions, the media people and the biology science people, together. And it's like at a conference I was at up in Alaska about a year ago, where we were talking about the problem with Western science being conducted on Alaskan wildlife without the input of the traditional thought and the native people of Alaska. Well, under the new subsistence law and the new court rulings about subsistence law, the agencies are supposed to talk constantly with the native people and supposed to involve their viewpoints and their thought. But they don't do it. Again, they haven't been trained, they've never heard of it before, so they resist it. Well, in the meantime, native people now have the law on their side, and of course they're taking the agencies to court and trying to make them do what they're supposed to be doing anyhow, and usually they oppose it and fight it rather than say, okay, a new ball game, I'll learn the rules and start working at it. But it doesn't happen that easily. And so little by little, the Native people are having to go to court to force the agency to do what the agencies by law are supposed to be doing anyhow. Really shouldn't be that difficult. But again, it's this dichotomy of thought and the lack of acceptance of the biologists on the one hand to accept the idea of traditional environmental knowledge as being good, solid knowledge, and then the elders and the old people and the leaders who oppose Western science. In the meantime, the animals are caught in the nutcracker in between. Well, this one lady had a neat quote. She said she's with the Inuit Institute, I think it is, in Saskatoon or Regina, I've forgotten which. But she said, I've been really working hard at this. She said, it's very difficult. She said, I go into the villages and I talk to the elders and try to talk about this from my background. Of course, a lot of them don't speak English, and she said it's very difficult to understand and get them to understand and communicate. She said, then I go and talk to the scientists, and she said it's just as tough because they don't speak English either, which I thought summed it up very, very nicely. There's not much communication between the sciences, the humanities, and nowadays there's this law on the books that there needs to be cooperation, understanding, working together with Native people, and it just doesn't happen except very slowly and a little bit at a time by clubbing people over the head. Well, it's exactly what we've been going through for 19 years with the film festival, trying to get, there's about 50 biologists in Missoula. Very seldom can get even one or two or three of them walk across the street and come to programs about wildlife where we might have some of the greatest people in the world who are involved with the media end of wildlife. And these guys won't even walk across the street to come and listen. And it goes on, and I know that that's the way it is. People are real slow to give up old ideas. They're really slow to accept new ideas. But little by little by little, you can make some headways. You have to do it for 19 years, and maybe you have to do it for another 19 years. The important thing is that you hang in there and do it. One thing that encourages me down through the years is that when English doctors found out that you should wash the knives after you operate on someone, that after you operate on somebody, you should wash the knives before you operate on somebody else. That's very, very important knowledge. It took 60 years for that knowledge to cross the English Channel, which is 22 miles wide. And that always gives me a little bit of comfort in slow rate of progress on these things. But things are happening, people are listening, and people are crossing over and listening to the other side. And I think with the workshop that we had yesterday, the whole thing about ethics and stewardship, again, people weren't listening. People who should be involved haven't been involved. But thanks to Marty Stauffer, the whole thing got pushed right out in front of our faces, whether we want to or not. And finally, people are really talking about it, and I think they're going to start doing things about it. Well, in all aspects of wildlife film, I see the same dichotomy over and over again, and that's why we keep coming back to this kind of a program, Wildlife and Civilization. We want to do more on it in Missoula. Next year is our big year, our 20th anniversary. So part of the workshop this afternoon is to talk about these things, see what's out there, see some directions, make some solutions, exchange some thoughts, involve other people from other aspects of society, and then hopefully also with this workshop we'll figure out a bigger and better program to do next year. I hope that what we can come up with this afternoon will give us some direction for a really major go at this whole topic of wildlife and civilization next year. I'm looking forward to something like a day and a half conference or something on a variety of topics, and where we can get a real mix of people involved with this. So keep those two things in mind in what you're here and what you might want to say this afternoon. I think Missoula is a great place to do it because we've got a lot of things that are very important relative to wildlife. Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation is here. One of the speakers yesterday was from there. It's probably the fastest growing environmental or conservation organization in the world. Their budget's hitting around $30 million a year. They can go out in one night, raise $1.5 million bucks for elk. And they put almost all of it back into elk. Boone and Crockett Club just moved here to their national headquarters. The Great Bear Foundation was founded here. Have things like all the Craighead Institute things going on here. We have an environmental writing thing on campus. And also on U of M we have what's about a 15-year-old program called Wilderness and Civilization. And we're using that as a model of how to talk about this whole thing. And we'll hear all about wilderness and civ and how these two thoughts can and should come together, and how do you bring them together, and how do you teach in that context. And I think that'll give us some guidance. Woody Kipp, who is one of the speakers, said the other day, he said, well, what he thinks is really significant in terms of this whole thing of Native Americans refining their culture and expanding and strengthening their cultural and religious things, and the rest of the world starting to gradually recognize American Indian religion as something valid. Until a few years ago, you couldn't anywhere in the world study Native American religion except in Sweden. It was the only place in the world you could study this sort of thing. I think there's getting to be acceptance in North America now of this is a very important part of our culture. But what Woody pointed out was that that Native American impact on the environmental movement has really been very significant and gradually may turn into an extremely important component of how we think about environmental things and do environmental things on a continental and eventually maybe even a world basis. So anyhow, we'll be looking at that aspect of it. We have two members of the Blackfeet government or reservation or people or nation who are going to talk about that. We've got some good speakers up here. There's also several people in the audience who I know want to contribute. Some of them have been off fishing and photographing and playing while I've been sweating in here. But anyhow, we got some really good speakers. I was hoping for a better audience at one of those things that happens. I made this whole batch of really neat flyers, had them all set up over in the office at Feet Community College, and it was a big wheel with the Indian Health Service. I never did figure out what he was doing. Quite soon off maybe in New Jersey on another federal assignment. But he's been around the block, and he's going to be one of our speakers. And Woody Kipp, who things in terms of Indian life. He came back several years ago after getting beat up in life quite a bit. Got a degree in journalism. Simultaneously, the journalism school, partly as a result of a program we had here at the Film Festival, created a Native American emphasis in journalism. And now Woody's teaching in that, and he'll be one of our speakers. Tom Birch is the person who more or less invented the Wilderness and Civilization program here on U of M campus, and I think will show us a nice framework for this whole thing of combining different types of thought. Swain Wolf, next to him, is one of a kind Missoulian native. He's I never been able to classify Swain in my mind until this morning. Another friend of mine, Michael Janide, at the end from California, described himself as an independent scholar. I said, hey, that's what Swain is. I just couldn't ever figure out what Swain was, but that's basically what he is. I was describing Swain to somebody this morning, and I said, once he's on his path is very, very carefully chosen, and he'll never see him off that. It might take 10 years, 15 years. He will get to the end of the path. He will get it done. And he's very single-minded and very particular, you might say. Michael, on the end, I didn't meet until a couple of days ago. He called me up from California and said, I think I should be on the program up there. And I said, why? So he told me why, and I said, well, come on. And I bought him a ticket, and here he is. So he's been specializing in the bird life in the classical literature. And he's going to tell about some very interesting things he has done. Yeah, that's a copy of what Chaucer's birds that turns out that Shakespeare, Chaucer, all Dante, all kinds of people were great bird watchers. And anyhow, he's found a niche there that's very, very interesting. But these guys will all be telling about how they see it from their perspective. And I'd like to call on Tom Birch first to just give a rough outline of how Wilderness and Civ works. I think it's a wonderful program, and it was invented right here, University of Montana, by Tom Birch.
I can try to tell you how it did work. I'm no longer teaching in it since I retired. So I don't know how it's been going the past couple of years. But I'll try to give you a general outline of some of our thinking about the program, and then in terms of its being a framework, I guess it's up to you all what you do with it. So I'll talk mostly about the Wilderness and Civilization program, and I'll try to make it brief, and then Dexter Roberts, who's sitting back here, who together with Bob Ream and me began the program, will tell us a story, I think, that's related to it. So he and I are going to try to split this time. We came up with the name Wilderness and Civilization, which is a bit ponderous, because we wanted the program to try to deal with the question of the interplay and integration of culture and nature. And then we thought, of course, that wilderness is the essence word for nature. This is all debatable. And culture, of course, is largely confused about the relationship between wilderness and civilization. But that was the best title we could come up with for the program. It does deal, the idea is to try to focus an interdisciplinary program of studies on that question in as many different dimensions as we could get it done. Basically, because we started it within the framework of the university, we just had to do it. So we didn't, when we began it, we didn't go through any channels, because we knew if we did that, we'd never get it established. University is not the sort of institution, in my opinion, that is very amicable towards anything that's genuinely alternative. And our thinking was that this should be alternative. And I suppose the most obvious alternative feature of the program was trips, and emphasis on trips into the wilderness, and that we made a requirement. We would always begin the program with a long backpack trip into some sort of wilderness area, whether it's official or not. I think in later years we've been concentrating on the Rocky Mountain front, that area, which is unprotected, not official wilderness. The idea there was to get the idea across through instituting it as part of the required framework of the program, just to get the idea across that it's absolutely essential to try to reestablish, maintain, recover what Thoreau called contact. Contact with the wildness and the wild others that are out there. So we would see lots of signs of wildlife, as well as lots of gorgeous rocks. Just plain rocks, but also elk racing up mountains, the tracks of bears and so forth. I don't think we ever had a bear encounter. Storms, weather, the wind on the Rocky Mountain front, those sorts of things. And the idea is to make that a requirement. Also, of course, there are other things about going into the wilderness, the simplicity of the formal life that you live that are important to try to recapture. A certain togetherness within groups develops. We would break our groups up, our overall program up into smaller groups and go in from different corners of an area, and then we would have a rendezvous in the middle where we would all come together, and then we'd go out in different directions. So that, of course, was often, we were often laughed at as instructors for taking the students out into the woods. Oh, you're just going out and having a good time, you know. But it's probably about the hardest work you'll ever do. We can get into that if you'd like. But the other two main sort of prongs of the overall framework of the program were, secondly, the academic portion. Okay, and that's essential. You go out and have direct experience of wild otherness, then you have to come back, as it were, what Wordsworth called those moments of tranquility, in which you try to recollect what may or may not have happened, and try to make some sense out of it. So we put a strong emphasis on the academic, and we had courses which we coordinated in literature, philosophy, environmental ethics, ecology, some good healthy science, economics, forestry, and drama. What have I left out? Something too. I think we've had some Native American stuff.
Very clear analysis of what we did in the Wilderness and Civilization program. Can you hear me? And Tom and I have always worked as a team since '75 in that program. I've also felt I was a team member with Woody at one point. It was '86, I think. And so there we were, up the Dearborn River. There's a spring, and we use it. It's a beautiful jewel-like green meadow because they claim there's giardia up in the upper reaches of the Dearborn from beaver, and there are huge beaver ponds up there, and beautiful animals that look like, you know, big ones. And the drinking water's no good further down. That night, we worked with James Welch's Fool's Crow, a bunch of students, and I would give them a chapter. Do this chapter in a good novel, the only good novel written yet in Montana. We need more of them. And then Kevin from Spokane had this chapter in Fool's Crow by James Welch. His latest book tells us a lot about Custer and real history up there, over there east. And Kevin had this chapter, and then it was about Fool's Crow, the young Blackfeet guy who hasn't proven himself yet, going to a holy man. We assume like his teepee is out closer to nature perhaps than the others. He's called there, the young fellow, and the old man, a man of wisdom, then says, "Raven came to me. Skunk bear's in a steel trap and can't get free. Get him free," essentially is the message, I think, in simplest terms. And I can't even think of that old fellow's name now. Okay, and so he does in this synopsis, very briefly. And he frees Skunk Bear. It's Wolverine. And with difficulty, and then he has accomplished a task of great importance. And then I played devil's advocate. Science and the devil are one, right? Said, "Kevin, how the hell can a raven come and talk to a man, an old guy sitting in a teepee?" And I got nowhere with it. He's saying, "Oh, Dexter, you don't understand the way things really work. He's a climber." And the next day we went up to Half Moon Park, which is further into the Canyon Creek fire. 250,000 acres burned in '88, what the circus likes to call catastrophic fire. And it's a forest of lodgepole pine everywhere. And gray snags and herds of elk, wildflowers they didn't know grew there, that haven't come up in 50 years after the fire. So we're way up in Half Moon Park, and we say, okay, so today we go up Scapegoat Peak. And I can make it. There's a way around back that Cunningham showed me, a guy I teach with. Kind of a goat trail, and then way behind, you know, with a day pack, and up to the top, 9,000 feet. It's like a long, not very steep plateau in back, and you're in the top of Scapegoat Mountain, which to all appearances is inaccessible. It's like sheer cliffs. It's like the Chinese wall, but further south into the Scapegoat Wilderness. So we go up on top, and 6 guys said, we'll go, and 6 women said, we're not going today. We're going to sketch. We're going to write in our journals. We're going to look around at songbirds. And boys go ahead. So 7 of us went up there. And we're standing on the top of Scapegoat Peak, and the wind is blowing like hell. And an animal came to the right periphery of our vision and walked in front of 7 young males and kept going. It went over the cliff, down. 10 seconds later, the head came back up. Looks like Mickey Mouse, with huge, bam, looking at us. And holy Christ, there's nothing out of it but a couple of distant colored prints the kids got, right? And Kevin said, Dexter, what's that? I said, it's skunk bear, Kevin. Skunk bear. And okay, it's the environment that's the teacher. Wild nature is the teacher. And Kevin started calling me coach after that. I said, yeah, coach, lead you to a certain place. This is the nature of the experience. And so if that happens once every 4 or 5 years, it's worth it. And you're wondering just what is the nature of awe and wonder, which is to say mystery and God undefined, or goddess undefined, really, are those powers that we're trying to introduce kids to. And then later on, I guess it was, hell, way back in 1986, Yetter and I and Bob Leader came off Kyoto, or Bear Track, up north of there, in the Badger 2 Medicine Roadless area. We came down and found Woody in his teepee at a powwow outside Hartview. And a hell of a lot happened as a consequence of that. There'd been 2 sun dogs that day for them. A straight band of rainbow, torrential June rain that came down, and important things had happened already, perhaps. So that was very interesting. Boy, do I recommend taking kids outside.
Thank you, Dexter. A real live drama. But that's good. I like that. And when a wildlife biologist is impressed by something like that, you know you've gotten somewhere. So I always want to look at the database, you know. The next speaker I'd like to have is Michael Janai from California, and he's come into this whole thing with a different window. It's been very exciting for me the last few days to find out what he's been up to, but it's quite interesting.
I've been bird watching all morning, saw 10 species of duck on one pond, 40 miles down the road. That was nice. Thank you very much, Jack. 20 minutes before I telephoned Chuck and asked him if I could come here, I had just had a telephone call from Nancy Perlman, who's your keynote speaker today. 2 years ago, Nancy made a film of one of my books called Walt Whitman's Wings, which I have in front of me here. I've been leaving it lying around there for people to glance at, and I'll do so again. Well, like you gentlemen, I used to be a university professor at Boston University. And when I'd been there 4 years and was apparently doing quite a good job, I was invited to stay forever. And I said, no, thank you very much, and went to get on with my life. And it was a great experience, but there was just a continual fight, of course, for money, and people from departments screaming this word excellence, excellence. You know, our search for excellence. Well, most of them were not excellent. However, they did have 200 students sitting in their classes listening to them and things like that. You know. And so I left and and got on with what I wanted to do, which was write books about birds in great literature. Now, I'd made a lot of films, all Super 8, of birds. Wherever I lived, I always made a film of the birds of that locality, and usually finished up showing those films to the Sierra Club and Audubon. I then started teaching courses independently in various colleges and universities on bird identification. At the same time, I started teaching courses on the ornithology in Chaucer and the ornithology in Shakespeare. And so I want to talk about that a bit, because my contribution in terms of civilization is language and the telling of stories. So my story starts with Aristotle, who wrote that book, called The Animals of the World in 10 volumes. And about 300 years behind him, he was Greek, don't forget, came Pliny, who was a Roman, who endorsed everything he said. And I'm going to tell you, I think, a story which is very fascinating, very beautiful, and will make a beautiful small film. So you've got a chance here to make film. It goes something like this. Aristotle, in collecting all his information for all his great knowledge of the animals of the world and the birds of the world in particular, obviously had a great interest, but he had, of course, information coming in. He would send people out on expedition to bring him information, farmers, fishermen. He listened to stories. They brought in their information, which is why, of course, some of the stories were so strange. There was one bird that was brought to his notice, and I don't know whether he ever saw it, but the information came in, and he called this bird, and I don't know the full Greek, but something cephalos, and that word meant soft-headed. He called it the soft-headed bird. When Pliny came round, he called it molliceps, which is Latin for soft-headed, so he was endorsing that. We have a big jump, and I now bring round to Chaucer. Chaucer has this bird in his writing, and he calls it a warriangle. Any takers? Middle English, this. He calls it a warriangle. I'll give it to you. Warriangle. Warri is a killer, Old High German. Angle is exactly what it says it is, an angle, and if it's sharp enough, it becomes a hook. So we're looking for a bird that's a killer with a hooked beak. The bird is now called warriangle. Along comes, I'm going to leave out William Turner and come on to George Turberville, great falconer, scholar, poet, who published a book in 1575 called The Book of Hawking and Falconry for the Sole Delight of All Noblemen and Gentlemen. Now we know for sure that Shakespeare read this book. I have a copy of this book myself, facsimile of course. There are 50 copies that actually exist in the world. Yale University has one. I borrowed the facsimile from there and then had my own facsimile made. I had to. So he called the bird a matagas, same bird, a matagas, which is a French word, Savoyard, from the Savoy, matagas, meaning the black and white killer. I'm going to still leave William Turner out because he publishes his book in 1554, and he gives it the name that we use in English today. I'll move on to our friend Carl von Linnaeus, and he called it Lanius excubitor. Any takers? The sentinel butcher. The sentinel butcher. Any takers?
Right.
Thank you. William Turner, who was a botanist and a churchman, and spent much of his time in Germany, knew this bird very well, and he knew it as a Neindödrer, 9 times a killer in German. In other words, a bird that kills much more than it needs. And he brought it into the English language as a shrike. And this is very interesting because there was already a bird in England being called a shrike, and that was a missel thrush, which is the size of an American robin, has a very strong singing voice, sings particularly well during storms, and is known to this day as a stormcock. But it did have the name shrike, even in Chaucer's time. However, that faded out, and our new shrike was this bird, the shrike, that we know, which is, of course, a lovely bird that fits in between the falcons and the flycatchers. Sits like a flycatcher, behaves like a flycatcher, also behaves like a small hawk. In fact, Florio, 1520, Florio describes it as a laneret, which means a minor version of a lanner, which is a Near Eastern falcon. So again, it's being described as a falcon. So now I come to my friend William Shakespeare. I started studying the birds in Shakespeare when I was 14 years old. I'm going to drop back a bit. I went to one of those very nice schools in England where they thrash you if you don't do your work. And one day we were doing the Tempest. And I had been bird watching all Sunday. I had been watching bar-tailed and black-tailed godwits. And on Monday we were doing the Tempest. And our teacher, who was a most unpleasant human being, who had been to the same school that he was now teaching at, and Oxford before that, said, we come to this word, gosh, I'm getting carried away here. We're talking about what I call the Yule Gibbons speech, where Caliban is following the butler and the clown down the beach and offering them to cook for them. And they pass him back the wine, and he makes a little speech in which he names all the wild foods that he will cook. And he names 8 wild foods. And that list of foods has things that Shakespeare knew as a child hazelnuts, which he called filberts, eggs from a jay's nest, apples from the hedgerow, and various other things. And finally, and sometimes I'll get the young scamels off the rocks. That's the end of the little food speech. And so our teacher says, look at your footnotes and you will find out what a scamel is. Well, down in the footnotes, written by a very famous scholar, it said, sometimes we have found the word scamel to mean a bar-tailed godwit in Norfolk. Well, Michael had been watching bar-tailed godwits yesterday.
Again, you can see he was the proper person to come up from California and talk about wildlife and civilization. I think we had it lucky there. The next speaker I was going to have is Woody Kipp, who is Blackfeet Indian. Over about the last 10 years, 3 times I've written semi-popular articles about bears or something to do with bears. And each time I ended up with the last sentence being, all the Indians were right all along. And it's part of the insights that I keep bumping into, and I think to see the Native American perspective on this whole topic will be very interesting. So Woody, please.
Thanks, Charlie, for inviting me here to talk a little bit. And as you may notice, I come without a prepared speech or any kind of notes or books. And I like to do this because I lecture quite frequently around the university and to civic groups and other people throughout the year. And I talk mainly from a background of being a Native American, and Native Americans up until a very short time ago, their history and their mythology and who they were, how they lived their lives as people on the earth came out of an oral tradition. So I like to do this, come and talk, and because of it, I sometimes jump around. I'm not quite as orderly as some other people might be who have a certain list that they go down and talk about. But I would like to talk a little bit about the whole aspect of where we are at today from my own subjective perspective, of course, in terms of wildlife, the environment, how this thing called civilization, because I am a writer, I teach writing, how literature enters into it. And with that, I guess I would jump all the way back to the gentleman who's got through talking about Shakespeare. I'd go back to maybe Don Quixote. What is the story about? What is Quixote doing? And where does this fit in with wildlife and civilization in 1996? Because I think what we're dealing here with is a lot of the thought and a lot of the processes that are going on right now are very, very much tied into the current technology. And because when you talk technology, you're talking money. A lot of the things that are happening today are technology tied to money. Without that whole prism of looking totally through it, of what is reality and what is dream and what is vision. It stops at the money and it stops at the technology. And I think Quixote might have been charging windmills, but he was making us think about this whole thing of what is vision, what is man's vision. And of course that vision has been altered considerably with the development of the high-tech methods of dealing with the world. And of course, we're still very close to our native traditions. We've only been away from it for, I don't know what people would give it different figures, maybe less than 100 years. A lot of our old people have still lived pretty close to their beliefs. And we have at this point in time, and in spite of what has happened in that last 150 years among my people, we have an immersion school on the reservation today, where children are taken into that school, and from the time they're there in the morning until the time they leave in the afternoon, no other language other than Blackfeet is spoken to them. And I am a victim of the policy of the Catholic Church because my folks were both fluent Blackfeet speakers and were full-bloods, but because of what they were taught about themselves and their as human beings, would not talk to their children in the Blackfeet language. So I speak what you would call broken Blackfeet today. But I know enough about the language and the concepts and what it says about the land and the animals that it says something totally different than what you say in English. You get a different graphic representation of the world. You get a whole different visionary look at animals that Jim Wells comes quite close to in his novel that Dexter alluded to, Fool's School. Because the things that were important to us at that time, the medicine bundles and the religious traditions, came from the natural world. And I wrote a column recently alluding to a book some 30 years ago written by a very famous economist, E.F. Schumacher, a book on economics. And of course, Schumacher was a world-renowned economist, worked for the British Cold War and other people, and he talks about a chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission who at one time made this startling statement that he says something to the fact that human beings could probably live very well on the earth without animals. And I find that very frightening. And I guess I find the concept of teaching children about wildlife with technology possible, but I know that a lot of people are being influenced, as they have been for 25 years, through cartoons. When children sit down in front of the TV on a Saturday morning and watch a representation of an animal that is very friendly, very jocular, and they come out here and when they become adults, bringing their children out and walk up to a bear or a buffalo, it's very a false representation. And so these are, like I say, there are a lot of things that we as natives see that are going on in the mainstream. I guess if you were to say what is environmentalism to us in terms of what is wildlife, we are trying to, because of what has happened to us historically for the last 125, 150 years, we are going back, reassessing where we are at in the latter part of the 20th century. We've made a lot of friends in the environmental communities because there is a lot of native thought, especially the spiritual thought that is being used by mainstream environmentalists in terms of man's relationship with the natural world. And there's a lot of synthesis going on, both ways. And so with that, I'll turn it back over to Charlie. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Woody. Every time I get involved with Indians, I learn something new. And I always thought Don Coyote was a Blackfeet story. You don't get much of that in wildlife biology. The next speaker I'd like to call on is Swain Wolf, a Missoula native. Wayne? Okay.
The way I've looked at the questions of wilderness, nature, and civilization is much different than anyone else that's probably in the room. And the reason I've had to do that is it's a very narrow, very reductionist way of looking at life, at this relationship between nature and people. And it's the only way I can think about it, and if I'm at fault, then I accept that. To give a kind of framework to start looking at these questions, I went back to energy level. what kind of an energy level did we evolve on? It was basically metabolic. The food we ate gave us the energy we needed to evolve the tools of survival, emotional and intellectual tools of survival. That was approximately 3,000 calories a day. The last time I did numbers on this, in the US, we're running about 300 times that. Plus, we have the leverage of technology. So the amount of energy that we have in modern culture compared to the hunting culture of our ancestors is enormous. The difference is enormous. And that affects how we see the world and how we think of the world. The way I've approached trying to understand how early hunting cultures thought about nature is to go back and find the stories that are representative of those cultures, most of which were collected by ethnographers at the turn of the century, and in one case, a story called The Woman Who Married the Bear from a bear clan in Alaska. You can't be totally purist about this because you don't know how those stories have changed. It's evident that the stories constantly changed, as I believe the rituals did. And that in itself is an interesting window into the thought of early hunters. The reason it's interesting to me is because it indicates a kind of scientific thinking, as versus, say, a religious form of thinking. And by that, what I mean is if you continually change the variety of the story and you continually change your ritual around a particular animal, and you can see the change because it shows up in a circumpolar way as it moves around. It doesn't stay fixed. Why doesn't it stay fixed? One of the things that strikes me that is very different between the way early hunting people thought of nature and the way we think of nature is they considered nature to be alive and aware. They considered nature to be in part dangerous, and they felt that they had to negotiate with nature to survive. There was a strong sense of reciprocity. These are all things I see coming out in the stories, the early stories. This sense of danger and importance and reciprocity with animals, I think reflects how there is a scientific understanding of the world. The difference I see between science and religion is that the science creates a hypothesis and they test it. Religion tends to be more dogmatic and allow things to be fixed. I don't know if this is right or not, but what occurs to me that is when you can afford to allow a thing to be fixed, an institution and an industry, say a church, builds up around it and holds it in place. Science can't afford to do that because what science is doing is dealing with the economy of the moment. It needs to find out how things work. Early hunters needed to find out how things worked. They looked at the world as carefully as they possibly could. You can see this in the cave paintings in France. The seeing there is phenomenal. Not only did they see the animal, the form of the animal, study the animal by dissecting it and eating it, but they watched it run and they watched it interact with the rest of the world. So those paintings had the whole animal there. It wasn't just a reproduction of a set animal standing in a glen somewhere. It was more than that. It was something that they saw in the animal that tied them to some hidden principle of nature. It was what tied them to the life force that ran through them as well as the animals. So what I see happening possibly, there's always possibly, is that you would formulate as a hunter an idea of how the world worked. And you would try to communicate with that idea of how the world worked. And one of the things you did was give something to get something back. You had to do this on a continual basis. This was your negotiation with some hidden principle. One of the ways you negotiate was the way you thought about the animal. Another was how you performed for it, the kind of ritual, and the other was the story you told about it. Naming certain animals could be very dangerous. The bear, for instance, I guess I've never met anybody who believed in the bear and the power of the bear who would say the name of the bear in their own language. They talk about it in very tertiary ways. Might be referred to it to as badger, it might refer to the bear as the dark space, the dark place on the hill. The animal who walks on two legs. There were a lot of euphemisms that were used to talk about the bear. But what happens in this process of trying to envision how the world worked and then communicate with that concept and showing up in ritual and story says to me that it was the same kind of thought that we use in science. Not exactly, but it's closer to that than it is to religious thought, I think. It would account for why things change constantly and why there's so many varieties. It feels to me as though you try one thing and it doesn't work, you try another. And you don't just junk what you have. You fiddle with it a little bit. You add something else to the ceremony, whether it's a song or an item or a piece of an animal or the timing of when you do something. This whole process, in any case, speaks to me to the fact that there is a different kind of thinking that goes on when you know your life is on the line. When you're living in this low energy world, by that I mean BTUs or calories, and you're trying to negotiate with the hidden principle of life, your attitude toward animals has to be so intense that it's almost a kind of spiritual paranoia. The entire world has to speak to you. We can't conceive of this, I don't think. You can go out there and you can be in it, but somehow you're dressed differently. You know that you're going back to your job. You know that you've got a car and a house and heat and a family that's subsidized, highly subsidized. And that's what differentiates us more than anything from early hunting people, is this immense subsidy that we have. There's nothing wrong with that. We're the same people we were then. We learned, in a sense, to trick nature. We were designed to live in a low energy economy of roughly 3,000 calories a day. And suddenly, in a very short span of time, we're living in this incredibly wealthy, very rich, very highly subsidized economy. So the question becomes then, all this stuff is vaguely accurate or based in anything real. How do you treat what's there? And how do you go on living? And one of the things you have to do is realign your relationship to animals and to the wilderness. We haven't been able to do that because we don't have the seeing it takes to do it, because we're not there. We see with cameras, which is not seeing at all, because it's not being there. So this is, in a sense, denying the entire wildlife film industry. And it is part of an industry, and basically, that's what wildlife's become. Wildlife is our industry. So much for us. But what about children? What about taking children out into the world, and how do they interact with that? A thing that I plan to initiate, I hope nationally, through the Watershed Foundation, is a project I call the Field Chronicles. The idea of this is to train some people to work with children and while they're teachers, keeping journals. The problem that I've seen with the kind of programs that take people out into the woods, into the wilderness, and spend a day or 3 or 4 days, is that there's not the opportunity to follow it up and see the patterns of change throughout a season. What I'd like to see happen with the Field Chronicles idea is that people would come over and over again to the same place throughout a season, throughout a year, throughout many years. And they would keep journals, and they would keep drawings, not photographs, but drawings. I think it's important that they draw. And the reason this idea came to be is because I was asking myself about the Blackfoot gold mine. How would a reasonable society not even let this happen? How would a reasonable society function without this even coming up and being presented? And the only thing I could think of is if you could go back and try to see a little about the world as ancient early hunting people saw it, that you would have an information base, a database, and you would have an emotional base, because you'd been there over and over and over, and you could testify in your heart and in your mind and in conferences to this place. And so you become, in a sense, a steward of that place from the time you're, 6 years old or whatever. That's enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Swain. I said earlier, I had always had a hard time classifying Swain until I heard the independent scholar. But in listening to him now, I had another thing that came to mind. And that copper top ad keeps going and going and going. I think that's the thing that I like most about Swain. He's going to be always in the same place, but a little bit farther ahead. He never lets go. But that's good. I've often said that there's a magic in Missoula, and I really believe that. There's people in this town we don't deserve. There things happen in this town all the time that just amaze the daylights out of me, and it's people like Swain that keep making it happen, I guess. There's actually 2 other speakers that did want to speak today. So before I go to Gordon, I think the 2 that wanted to speak is Brian Leith, who won the top award in the festival this year, and he felt compelled to say something on this program, and then his colleague also from England, Alistair Fothergill, who is the current head of the BBC Natural History Unit, which is, I think, at least over any period of time, been the topmost production unit anywhere in the world in terms of wildlife film. So we have 2 very distinguished people here. And I'd like to ask Brian to talk first, if that's okay.
First of all, can I apologize for our late arrival? Coming from a country which is impoverished in wilderness, we were taking advantage of your excess, and we were out fishing, not with any success, I may add. In fact, I've got to say, I don't know how Alistair feels. I feel that we're coming at this whole issue from really a very different angle as filmmakers. The only thing I really feel I could add that's perhaps of value is something that actually contradicts a lot of what's being said, and that I do believe. And that is that I think that perhaps it's become fashionable for one reason or another to feel guilt about what humanity has done to the world. And I actually think this is mistaken. You know, I think that even what we do now is natural in every sense. And I believe that we may come in the future to see that a lot of what we have done and what we are doing and the contribution we are making to the world, to creation, is actually very positive. To give you an example, is there another species that gathers in a room and discusses the role of the other species in relation to itself? No. I mean, you know, we like to think that, you know, this sort of fashion has it that we've come from an age of enlightenment and harmony, and we're going to a sort of horrible darkness, and this whole sort of millennialist sort of doom has become very fashionable. But I think it's actually mainly nonsense. And I think that it's interesting that even Edward Wilson, the great biologist, reckons that if the worst scenario comes true in terms of our impact on the world species, we may, if we're very unlucky, lose something like 30 to 40% of those species. Now, that would be a catastrophe, of course, but 30 to 40% of the world species is nowhere near what we've lost 5 times before in the history of the world. Not only that, but diversity through evolution has increased steadily. We now, even today, sit in a world with more species than existed a billion years ago, many more than existed 2 billion years ago. And so I think it's very important to see a sort of ebb and flow of life. The extinction of death is actually natural as well. And I think just to take a small story to illustrate this, David Western, who's the current head of the Kenya Wildlife Service, has worked for many years with the Maasai people, the indigenous African tribe who live in much of East Africa. And he's come to the conclusion that the places where the Maasai have lived, and don't forget that these people have lived there among these animals for 4 or 5 million years. This is where the first human beings came from. And maybe it's no coincidence that this is the last place on Earth with vast megafauna. And it's a very interesting coincidence that these two things should go together. But David Western reckons that just locally through Africa, it's the places where you find people living admittedly at low level and without a great deal of impact. I mean, we're not talking here of Manila or Nairobi, but places where indigenous people, African people live, that you find the greatest diversity of wildlife. In other words, we don't have anything to feel guilty about. And also, there is a direct connection between Aboriginal indigenous peoples and perhaps what we do today. And I think rather than going from an age of harmony and enlightenment to one of darkness, I suggest to you that the people who sit down in meetings in Geneva and Washington and debate transboundary air pollution, the people who sit down at meetings in Missoula, Montana, and discuss the ethics of wildlife filmmaking, these are actually signs, these are the tips of an iceberg of a very, very enlightened creature. And I think we should stop beating ourselves over the back with big rods and start thinking in much more positive terms about our role and where it's going. That's the only thing I'd like to say.
Thank you, Brian. The only thing I'd add, I guess, is that, you know, mankind collectively is
Could be here all night. I don't like anybody to back me. Concept of civilization is a heady thing. Sitting here, I began to realize how heady it truly is. But I don't want to spend a lot of time in my part of the discussion or my part of the presentation to talk about Western civilization and the acts of remediation or whatever that's going on right now to try to create that balance that at one time was there. I want to step back and take a little bit of look at what the tribe, especially the Blackfeet, are trying to do with its own people. I think as we lose our children to the educational system for 8 to 12 hours a day, I think we're beginning to see the consequences of our myths, our oral histories, our traditions, our language. We're losing them very rapidly. And because of that, some of the problems that didn't occur a couple hundred years ago are now becoming really evident on a reservation that Woody and I are from. We're relatively newcomers to this concept of remediation and Western definitions of civilization and the impact it has on wildness or wildlife, environment, and so forth. Prior to 1924, we were classified feri naturae by the people that spoke the political and legal philosophies of the United States. So we were classified with the very things that we're taking a look at to see whether or not we can provide a safe haven for the future, and possibly for that evolutionary thing that's is supposed to occur at that point, bringing us into a better place. So we're relatively newcomers at remediation, but I think we're going to take responsibility for that. And I think that's why Woody and I are here, is that this forum allows us to hear and allows us to have input into what is going on at this level, so that maybe we can offer some solutions. But what I want to share with you today basically is the kind of paradigm shifts that we're dealing with on a reservation now, that our young people and people of Woody and my generation that we've had to go through in order to get the tools, in order to get out there and try to be part of a positive solution to what's going on, not only in society in general or this country with our excesses, but with the reservations and some of the excesses in environment that are occurring there that we want to keep as long as we possibly can. So with that disclaimer, I want to read you something from a book called The Blackfeet by John Ewers. Blackfeet Raiders on the Northwestern Plains. Dr. Ewers is some fancy title back in Smithsonian Institute, but he's an elder and he's emeritus at the Smithsonian and Museum of Natural History. But he did spend a lot of time with the Blackfeet, and I'm not here to question the wisdom of the elders, but they adopted him into the tribe. So I'm very cognizant of that fact that he was, by adoption, a member of the tribe, and it's not my place to question why that occurred. But he did say some real salient things that I want to make two quotations here. And in the book, The Old Time Religion, Dr. Ewers goes on to say, the Blackfoot Indians lived in a world of uncertainty. Their lives were plagued by the fear of death from starvation, from sickness, or at the hands of their many human enemies. If they had less cause to fear starvation in the middle of the 19th century than had their prehistoric ancestors, they had more reason to fear sickness. Their old men and women could recall the disastrous losses their tribe had suffered in 2 smallpox epidemics. They were still surrounded by hostile tribes, any which might send a mobile raiding party against one of their isolated hunting camps without warnings. Yet the Blackfeet did not face these dangers alone. They believed they were surrounded by supernatural powers much stronger than human ones, which they called upon for protection against evil influences and to aid them in their own undertakings. These powers resided in the skies and the waters, as well as on the land. Sun and thunder were the most powerful sky spirits. Beaver and otter were potent underwater ones. Buffalo, bears, elk, horses, snakes, eagles, crows, and other animals, birds of the Blackfeet country, also could communicate their powers to human. Supernatural powers invariably were given to men in dreams. Rarely did a man experience a dream of power while he was sleeping at home in the lodge of his family. Dreams of power did come to some young men when they were alone and separated from fellow members of a war party, but more commonly a young man actively sought supernatural aid by going out alone on foot to some isolated spot at a distance from camp, there on a bare hilltop beside a lake or some other rare frequented place. The young man fasted and called upon the powers of the sky, earth, and water to have pity upon him. Hear, O son, hear, O man, above people, listen, underwater people, listen. Then he remained without food and water and exhausted and fell asleep. It goes on and explains in detail what is really important to the tribal people. When we try to explain the concept of universality or balance of nature, we use the symbol of the circle, but to me it's a little bit more complicated than that. It's almost like a sphere, and with that sphere is all the things that we have to relate to in order to give us that balance that we need to. If any one part of that is impacted negatively, then it's going to have impacts on all other parts of that Blackfoot society or that Blackfeet concept or that Blackfeet definition of paradigm that we try to live with for the past several 100,000 years. The thing that's important to us is that not only do we have to define wildness and civilization as two opposing dichotomies, but at some point we came or evolved or came from a place where the definitions or the lines of definitions weren't that black and white. The ideas of communicating with various messengers that could tell you what powers you needed in order to help your people were very important to us. Besides having the animate things like rocks and mountains and forests and places were very critical to us in order to do those kind of healings and maintaining that sense of balance that we all had for that period of time. In addition to that, we had spiritual entities, that there was various doors to the ceremonies and rituals that even to this day can be utilized to make sure that the things out there that are called wild come to us in various dreams or various other manifestations and allow us to work with our people. And we're at a point where we're beginning to lose that contact, and I think that's what I want to really emphasize, is that we're trying to be able to get to a point where we can provide various mechanisms, including technology, because our elders are leaving us very, very quickly. Every time they leave, it's like a major part of the encyclopedia of knowledge is leaving with them. So we're looking at technology, we're looking at films, we're looking at the various things that can maintain this treasure house or this treasure trove of knowledge and wisdom that we need in order to maintain that balance on the reservation. At times, the reservation is not the safest place to be, those of us that are growing up there, but I think that's because we haven't relied on the teaching of the elders and some of the philosophies that we've had in the past, and we need to begin to talk about a renaissance, or we begin to talk about doing the things necessary to bring some of those philosophies and attitudes back to our people, so that all the things that manifest itself in alcohol abuse or drug abuse are done away with, so that we can become the kind of people we once were, very proud and spiritual people. The medicine people or the cultural people or the elders are really the glue, and it's really sad that you don't have the opportunity to listen to the elders. We try to protect the elders as much as possible, the true medicine people. Otherwise, they'd be inundated by people, interviewing them and trying to extract from them the knowledge and wisdom that they have. So it's usually people like Woody and I, or Thomas Banyaka with the Hopis. Everybody has their Thomas Banyaka, who is that intermediary between the elders and modern society, and which allows him the opportunity to try to explain to society what their philosophy is, but also to explain the elders what is outside the confines of their community, of their reservations in terms of Western society, so that at some point there's a balance that's created. The medicine people really genuinely believe that through their prayers and through their supplications to the Great Spirit or to the spirits that they generally hold the universe together. And by that I don't mean just the earth or not just the United States or not just the reservation, that they are totally committed to the idea that those things out there that need protection, like wildlife and other things, that their prayers are for all of us, not just the Blackfeet or not just Indian people, but all of us, including the sky people, the four-leggeds that walk on the earth, and the water people, and all the other spirits that inhabit the earth that help us from time to time. So they genuinely believe that it's important that they do this, they offer their prayers. But they're faced with a dilemma right now of trying to figure out how to transition what they know and what wisdom they have and rights they have to a younger group of people that will carry on these things, because they believe that if they leave at this point in time without people to take over for them, then we're going to have a much worse world and United States than we have at this point in time. So they're very concerned about what transitions that they make as they get older and leave to the other side. One of the things that prevent us as traditional people, or those aspiring to be traditional people, learning from our elders and cultural people, is that within our traditional societies, our tribal societies, there's some things that we have to try to put back together. There's some things that have been done to us that, because of the nature of our philosophy, if one thing happens that is detrimental to the tribe, then it has adverse impact on all of the societies of animals and human beings, and no matter what part of the country or what part of the universe that they're from. So we have situations that occurred a couple years ago where we had a family and an individual in Browning. The family is called Scriber. They collected some of the medicine bundles over the course of the past probably 100 years, that many of them were very spiritual bundles that the tribe needed in order to maintain this balance that I spoke to you about. After 100 years, we learned that this collection existed, and we wanted to try to take from that collection those medicine bundles that we needed in order to maintain that stability. We weren't given that opportunity, and it was sold to a provincial museum in Alberta, in Edmonton. And out of that collection, there's things like medicine pipe bundles, Sundance bundles, and also probably the only beaver bundle in existence that I'm aware of. And a beaver bundle is a representation of all the animals and all the elements of humanity in the world that's important to maintaining that glue that I talked to you about. What they did in Edmonton is seal the collection for 7 years. This was a couple years ago. So we got 5 more years before they take the collection out of the vaults, so that the elders can go and take a look at it and try to maintain some connection with those bundles. Because they weren't taken care of for that period of time, we can understand from our point of view why there's so much chaos, not only in the world, but there's so much chaos on the reservation. So we need to create that kind of balance by properly taking care of these bundles. The museum staff people basically took a crap shoot on the elders, those that know the ceremonies, those that know the rituals, dying out before that 7-year period. If not dying out, then they're going to add 7 years of age onto themselves, and they may or may not be able to recall the songs and the rituals and the things that we need to do in order to affect that. We tried to get the collection back, or at least parts of it that were religious, but we couldn't do that because it was from a different country, Canada. But we're still trying to negotiate with them under the premise that it's the right thing to do. It's an ethical thing to do. It's a moral thing to do. And by giving us back those religious, what they call artifacts, we'll be able to not only take care of ourselves, but take care of your children, your grandchildren, and future generations of children. So that's one example. The other example was sacred geography. I think was mentioned, the Badger Two Medicine Chief Mountain Sweetgrass Hills, the Sand Hills in Saskatchewan. All of these places are very, very sacred to the Blackfeet, not to the exclusion of other sites that are still secret or other sites that exist on the reservations and throughout, for example, for the Blackfeet in the state of Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, the Dakotas, and into the Canadian provinces. Those sacred sites have traditionally been sites where our medicine people need to go in order to maintain that glue that I talked to you about, or maintain that power that we need to make sure everything is in place. It hasn't always been conducive to the Blackfeet or to the environment, where we've had people going in with mining claims under the 1871 Mining Act. They say that East Butte of Sweetgrass Hills is going to look like craters of the moon within 4 or 5 years if everybody accessed their mining claims. The Badger 2 medicine with its drilling for oil. All these things, from an economic point of view, may have points of debate and argument, but from a cultural and spiritual point of view, you can see the trauma that they create to these medicine people who are trying to maintain this balance. And it makes it more difficult for them when they have people that just walk roughshod over their feelings and the religion of the tribe. The American Indian Religious Freedom Act, which was supposed to close, or was supposed to strengthen the claims of the tribe, has been, it's been gutted. It really doesn't provide anything as far as even slowing down some of the things that's going on. Some of the elders built a sweat lodge up on East Butte in Sweetgrass Hills. And we figured, well, because we're going to build it on the road here, you know, the mining companies really can't come in now, because we've just kind of, we put a roadblock up here, and it should be covered under ARFA, or American Indian Religious Freedom Act. Well, we went up there in a couple of weeks, and they had plowed it with a bulldozer. And it came to our attention, we couldn't figure out why they would do that and not suffer the consequences of adverse publicity or ARFA or feel the wrath of the federal government. But we were told that in 1954, there was a convention of anthropologists and archaeologists that met someplace in the United States. We still haven't found out where they met. And they said anything prior to 1954 was archaeologically significant, meaning all the religious sites and so forth. Anything after 1954 really didn't matter, because we had been civilized by that point. So because of that, you can see that what hope we had for ARFA and the pieces of federal legislation that were to protect us, that were just kind of plowed under with that bulldozer. So the consequences of that is, what are the elders going to do in order to, or the medicine people going to do in order to maintain that balance? I want to talk a little bit about wildlife, bears and buffalo. Well, maybe I'll just talk about bears right now. We have a whole raging debate with bears on the Blackfeet. I'm still waiting for a bear management plan that they've been working on for about 10 years now. The bear has always been very, very dangerous for us because of the power it represents. So we've always been very careful to, talking about it and doing things around bears and so forth. Some of our earliest lodges were bear lodges that were primarily there for transference of power and healing of individuals that have various diseases and sicknesses. It was brought to the attention of the tribal council, and I respect the tribal councils for what they represent as manifestation of the Indian Reorganization Act and this one man, one vote concept, but most of them don't reflect traditional tribal leadership. It was imposed by federal legislation that allowed them to come and be elected and sit on the tribal council. So, I'm not slighting them, but nobody went to the medicine people and said, let's talk about bears, let's see how bears and wolves and buffalo, eagles, how that all fits into the whole universality that I talked about. So right now, we have a bear that eats, goes into the garbage can, or pulls down a calf, or pulls down a cow, or pulls down a prize racehorse. or kills some lambs or sheep. Whenever that occurs, that animal is killed. They have, euphemisms like the word cull, So they go out and cull that bear regardless of what the consequences are culturally and traditionally. The other thing that's happening is some of the ranchers, tribal members or non-tribal members that are ranching on a reservation, when you have a bear that's a potential problem or a problem to them, they'll shoot the bear and bury it. Well, that's a legal issue if you want to look at it that. But from a cultural and traditional and spiritual point of view, we're taking something that's considered a brother and a sister, and we're doing cultural and traditional homicide. We're killing an animal that's so important to us in maintaining that balance that we're allowing people to come in under the guise of something called culling, and we're allowing them to come in and kill the wolves, to kill the bears, to kill whatever is needed in that ceremony and ritual to promote healing at every level, including environmental level. So again, the traditional people are saying, okay, what do we need to do in order to deal with this, to maintain that balance? Because if it wasn't for us, I think the world's going to be a much worse place than it is right now. I just got a couple other things here and I'll finish. Bundles, any religious objects, anything that we need, like bear knives or things like that, to have healing ceremonies for the land, for the animals, for human beings. At one point in our development as a nation, or our evolution as a nation, those were sold to museum and private collectors. And because of that, you can see they pull away from the reservations the very things, the very power objects and spiritual objects that we needed in order to maintain that balance. And there's provisions right now, a lot of the stuff is beginning to come back. But it's coming back in an environment where a lot of the elders are no longer there. In 1969, we looked around the communities in Browning and we found about 300 people that had genuine knowledge about culture and traditions, ceremonies, and rituals. Now that's probably less than 50 that have that knowledge. So as time begins to go on, those individuals that we need to guide us through those rituals is very critically being eroded. I'll pause here to say that it's really important. I watched a movie the other night called Plastic Medicine Men or something like that. And some of the New Agers are beginning to get involved in traditional religions, and I can't speak to that. But what I can speak to is the fact that in our religion and our I shouldn't say religion, and our spirituality, we have individuals that from the moment they were born understand the implications of their getting involved in rituals and ceremonies. So there's elements of control and understanding as you go up the ladder. We understand as traditional people that if we do something that the Creator maintains is wrong, or something that we know is wrong and we continue to plow ahead, that'll impact not on us as individuals, but it'll impact on our family. So that provides a very profound control mechanism for us to do things in a way that is respectful and that we understand the consequences of our actions. So if you don't know the consequences of your actions, you shouldn't be having sweat lodges, you shouldn't be having sun dances, you shouldn't be doing the various things without having this group of elders and cultural people as part of your advisory group, or at least helping you, because the consequences to you and your family, or these people and their families, is tremendous and may result in some very strange things happening. I wanted to mention the Smithsonian. After several hundred years, a collection of skulls was transferred from the War Department, which was someplace in the central part of the United States, I think it was Iowa or someplace, to the Smithsonian. It was 10,000 skulls. So each tribe, and I think the Blackfeet were the first to go in and get the skulls of our ancestors. They were doing the forensic studies. That in itself is wrong. That in itself is ethically and morally wrong. Where somebody chops off the head of they call it a green head. You just die and you're buried, and they'll chop off your head and so it can be studied. That in itself is really bad. But what makes the resting of that spirit in terms of our spirituality such a difficult thing is we don't have ceremonies and rituals for reburial. So we have to invent something like a burial ceremony again in order to put these people to rest. So you say, well, why is the prevalence of all the diseases and chaos reigning on a reservation? Well, that's an indicator, one thing that we can take a look at, and we're trying to reconcile at this point. It's very difficult for the elders, even now, to go on some land that's been taken from the tribe and put as fee patent land. Other people have it, it's their property now, and that's fine, I guess. But the problem we're having is that those traditional places, we used to get our roots, we used to get our herbs, we used to get our paints, all the things that we needed for these doctoring ceremonies and maintaining that sense of power for the tribes. It's all fenced off now, no trespassing. If you try to get access to it, you're shot at or beat up or whatever. So that again is creating a problem that we're having to deal with locally. It even goes so far as fighting over rocks. Several years ago in Glacier Park, a large red rock, an ochre-colored rock, was washed down from Glacier Park. Because of the significance and size and color of that rock, everybody knew it had power, that it could do some really good things for the tribe and in the ceremonies and rituals. But then everybody started fighting over the rock. Everybody had title. Everybody wanted control of that. Well, after the course of several weeks of fighting over the red rock, the Catholic Church got it. So now the rock, if you want to go to Browning, the red rock is in the yard of the Catholic Church next to the church there. And that's another story. I want to close now because I've taken more of my time. One last thing I want to say, and I say to every group that I meet with, the way you could help the tribes right now that I see, and because I have a special interest in bears, especially grizzly bears, the rancher reimbursement program for the Great Bear Foundation is we're always struggling every year to try to get enough money to get the ranchers reimbursed so they don't kill these bears. If you can, help us identify resources and give them to Chuck, or if you have any donations that you can give to us for the rancher reimbursement, Chuck is on the board. We really need some help. Again, I told you before that, if the bears are presenting a nuisance to the ranchers, or if they're presenting a nuisance to the game wardens, they're going to be shot and killed. Even some of the assistant game wardens, who are the very people we hired to take care of the bears, including the grizzly bears, they are ranchers part-time, and they said, if any bear, including a grizzly bear, does anything to my horses or my cows, we'll shoot them and bury them. So we don't want bears to be shot and buried. If it means money through a rancher reimbursement, then we need your help. And that's one way you can help us. We're going to continue, Woody and I and other people are going to continue to work on our reservation to try to resolve some of these problem areas that I talked to you about. So we may not be out front trying to resolve or remediate things at this level, or Montana or United States or Africa or whatever, because I think we've got some full-time problems on our reservation that we need to resolve. And so we're going to be working at that level, and hopefully we'll meet in the middle. Thank you.
On the environment, not on nature, they've been around a bit longer, but weekly programs. And these challenges of matching the environmental concerns with the media challenges and the wildlife concerns will continue into the next 25 years of my life, I'm sure. But it's wonderful to come to an event like this and see such gorgeous films, fantastic films, beautiful films. It's hard sometimes to find the appropriate adjectives for the works that I've been watching at the screenings. They've been so moving, and I just wish I could be out there enjoying that wildlife myself. And so I have to take it vicariously, but it's well worth doing so. It's hardly necessary for me to detail the plight of animals and plants that share this earth with us. All of you are well aware and could easily be up here as I am to discuss the biodiversity needs, the habitat preservation, the elimination of species extinction. I mean, these are all concerns that you're knowledgeable about. So I'm not going to try and bore you with talking about the thousands of species on the planet. I would like to remind you of something that Gro Harlem Brundtland said when she was Prime Minister of Norway, and she also headed up a United Nations Commission about the environment named after her, the Brundtland Commission, and put out an excellent report. And she said, "We are living in an historic transitional period in which awareness of the conflict between human activities and environmental constraints is literally exploding. Never before in our history have we had so much knowledge, technology, and resources. Never before have we had such great capacities. The time and the opportunity has come to break out of the negative trends of the past." And that's what I think we've heard some of this dialogue at the workshops, where we're trying to break out of those trends and move into a new trend. It's due to people like you who make or watch, I'm sure I have both here in the audience, and we do both regardless, who make and watch wildlife films, that we can develop these positive trends for both the present and the future. You know, environmental activism is something that can be motivated by the films, by the images, by the audio. And audio in films and TV is equally important to the images, what is said about what we're seeing. And we're moved by that. And I think most of us as children are moved. If you look at the volumes of books and publications for children, it's nature, it's animals, it's plants, but the animals attract. And I think they give us that initial tie to the earth. I mean, whether or not it was, if you had the experiences I did when I was camping as a child and the bear came to the tent, or as I'm later in my life running down the trail and the bears and I encounter each other, you realize that there's a connection here. I mean, I'm still waiting to run into the mountain lion. I'd love to see a mountain lion in the wild. There's so many other animals that I would love to see. I've been fortunate enough to have traveled to over 50 countries, and the thing that I try to do in every single country is go out and get out of the city and see the wildlife, because that is what connects me to this planet Earth. So the trends that we have can be positive. We need to make those stories. But is the information being given accurate? Is it reliable? This is a controversial debate. I wasn't here last year or the year before, but I've heard that there's been some debate over that. My answer to my own question is yes and no. You know, I've often wondered, for example, how lions or chimpanzees, birds, or any other species for that matter, at least the bigger ones, can, you know, be born, grow up, find a mate, have sex, get pregnant, give birth, raise young, and die all in 1 hour. I marvel at it. I just quite frankly wish that maybe we had some of those miracles of the screen in real life. You know, if we could have everything happen that fast, maybe we could save some of these animals from extinction. But before I go into a little bit more detail, I want to be sure that you don't misunderstand some of my comments, and misunderstanding communication is so important in this medium. You know, because I'm reminded of that medical doctor. He was in the medical service, an OB/GYN practice. You know, he had a Korean woman come in who was in very active labor and very active pain. And the doctor said, "Well, would you like some pain medicine?" And the woman said, no, I'm in enough pain already. Well, a little communication is important, and we have to be sure that we express ourselves correctly to get our message across correctly. And I'm pained, quite frankly, by the continued expansion of an overpopulated society. People have been asking me the last few days, well, what's the theme of my talk? And of course, it's wildlife, it's film, but I kept thinking about it as I reread my presentation, as I thought about what was being said at the workshops. And I keep coming back to the one critical concern that made me an environmentalist in the first place. In 1968, I sat in a biology class. I was trying to learn the parts of the body and how they function. But the instructor was had a lot of foresight, and she said, you need to read this book called The Population Bomb. It had just come out. It was written by Dr. Paul Ehrlich, a very well-known biologist who he was the co-creator of the coevolution theory, along with Dr. Peter Raven, who is with the Missouri Botanical Garden. Dr. Ehrlich is there at Stanford, and he's done the longest study of the butterflies and population explosion and so forth. And he's written numerous books, extensive number of books since then. But I read this short little book, and I said, you know, we are overpopulated. We are extremely overpopulated. And if we don't get a handle on human overpopulation, we're not going to get a handle on any of the other problems facing us, environmentally speaking. And I commend people who are working just on trying to save one habitat. One of my very first concerns, because I happened to get a little newsletter, it was only $1 membership, and as a student that seemed pretty good. I'll pay my $1 for the Committee for the Preservation of the Tule Elk. This was the smallest elk species in the world. It'd gotten down to about 22 animals in the 1922s. There was a woman who turned out later to, she happened to become my mother-in-law, and now my ex-mother-in-law, and she worked for about 20 years to try and save that Tule elk and create a national wildlife refuge in the Owens Valley, and she was successful at it. And it proved to me what people can do. Just an elementary school teacher can, you know, fight and lead a battle like that. And it's efforts like that that when we get together as people and we work together, we can accomplish a lot. And I prided her for working on just the Tule elk. I mean, she was dedicated to it, because if we didn't have that one woman working on that one species, I don't think those animals would be saved. But yet, at the same time, we have to look at the bigger picture. We have to look at the small picture. We have to look at the bigger picture. Our very survival and that of our descendants will depend upon maintaining the basic ecosystem services performed by the countless living things, from those large vertebrates, including us, I guess, and the invertebrates down to the microbes, even the air, the water, and the earth itself. I mean, some people may even say that, you know, the rocks have life, and in a way they do. It's much easier for us as filmmakers and people telling the environmental story to talk about the relationship between the large plants and animals and their importance to the bigger scheme of things than it is to document the battle over a canyon, a river, or a forest that has some, well, those battles are actually easier to document too if they have some rare and endangered species. That draws a lot of attention. But the really hard story to tell is the one that's going to be the challenge for future filmmakers. And I see that as the one that shows how overconsumption, aside from overpopulation of the billions of people on this planet, is causing wildlife extinction. It's going to be the task of the filmmaker to show that the greed for more profits at the expense of environmental cleanliness is causing ecological disaster. It's going to be the role of filmmakers to show that environmental destruction, which seems so innocuous. I'm talking about that next housing tract, that just little suburban development, the next mini mall, the next shopping mall, the next freeway, is truly the real threat to species endangered and otherwise. One of my last award-winning films was called Population Crisis USA. It's the first major documentary, and I just finished it in 1993, to talk about overpopulation in the United States. And I tried to look and see what was already available. And I discovered there were plenty of shows, films about overpopulation in the rest of the world, because it's much easier to go to India or Ethiopia and show people dying in the streets. But how in this country do I show that our wonderful lifestyle, which is really plotted in the regular movies. You look at any of the movies and you see people with cars and houses and conveniences, refrigerators and running water, and all these things that we take for granted. Just our ordinary everyday lifestyle of the middle class and even the poor in this country is 1,000 times better than the majority of the people in the world. And how do you show these things that you and I enjoy? And I admit, I enjoy having my running water. I enjoy flicking on the switch and having my lights and electricity, and I enjoy turning on my TV when I want to see what's going on in the news. I enjoy all these. How do I show that this is awful and this is causing wildlife extinction? And this is what's the problem with overpopulation in the United States. I'll tell you, it was not an easy story to tell. It was much easier for my first Emmy Award-winning piece called Gem in the Heart of the City about the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area and Rim of the Valley Corridor, an area that most people ignore because they think that Los Angeles is just a bunch of freeways and development, but it happens to be in Los Angeles. And it was a lot easier to go up there and show the wonderful recreational, cultural opportunities. I was the first to go and document on film the winter solstice site of the Chumash Indian, which was on Rockadyne's property. Nobody had been allowed ever to go in and film this site. There was a mock-up in the Southwest Museum showing how the light came down. You know, we used the mock-up, but we went out to the real site. It was a lot easier to go out there and show the animals, show people hiking on the trails, show people bicycling, show the wheelchair trails, all these kinds of things. But to try and show these interrelationships, it's a problem. It's a real problem, and I challenge all of us to do it. And it reminds me of a story that of the man who had a very large dog, and his neighbor had a pet rabbit that was kept in a cage next door. And one day the dog came home with a rabbit in its mouth. And naturally, the people were very upset. They didn't really want to have their neighbor know that their dog came home with the rabbit in the mouth. So what did? They washed the rabbit, and they took the blow dryer, and they blow dried the rabbit and made it all clean and nice again, and they went and snuck it back in the night to the cage. So the next day, the neighbor comes back and says, you know, the oddest thing happened. Yesterday, our rabbit died, and we buried it, and today it was in the cage. Well, I think that we have to be daring enough to tell the truth. I mean, the neighbor obviously wasn't. We have the problem, though, of making it educational and entertaining while we're telling this horrible story, all at the same time. Our job isn't easy. Communication is truly difficult. When I started doing radio, I discovered that I'd been supposedly taught to read, write, you know, the R's, arithmetic, and so forth. But there was one skill that, at least in my educational system in Southern California, we hadn't been taught, and that was the art of listening. And I found that when I was doing my interviews, that it was really better, rather than try and be ready to ask my next question that I'd all prepared, would be to listen to what my guest had to say, what the person was saying, and then respond to it. And it was a much better interview. We have to be willing to listen to what's going on out there and use all of our senses. As an environmental broadcaster, I'm pained by the minimal coverage on the airways, as I'm sure you all are. We would all like our works to be shown so many more times. Now, outside of my shows, of course, and the films that we see here, these wonderful films at the festival, we have very little coverage on the airwaves of nature, of wildlife, of environmental issues. Over the years of doing my programs, I've done a significant number on wildlife and habitat, although I don't attempt to do the nature ones that I've seen so beautifully presented here, because other people are doing it. What I'm trying to do is bridge that gap. And, but I find that few shows other than mine tackle these controversial debates over saving a unique ecosystem versus allowing it to be turned into dumps, to freeways, to other developments. You know, quite frankly, it's difficult because these battles go on for many phases. You know, it's like my ex-mother-in-law. I knew her before I met my ex, and then I worked with them as a family team, and then I continue to work with her after the divorce, and it continues to this day that we have to keep up on what we think are successes. Even though those refuges were established, there's still threats to them. The outside pressures, almost every single national park in this country has serious threats, be it air pollution or dams or too many tourists doing the wrong thing. I mean, I've gone to parks and seen people take their saw out and cut down live trees, and nowadays we're really afraid to even confront people and say, no, this isn't the proper behavior. I mean, I've come from central Los Angeles, and you know, I've had the problems of burglaries and riots, and I was in the heart of it all. And I'm afraid to confront people when they pass by and they paint on my walls and they do other kinds of things. I've had the guns pulled out in front of me at my home, and it's a scary kind of endeavor. But yet, I think that's just part of living in the city. I'm not going to run away because I want that wilderness to be wilderness. I want a home for the wildlife, and if I go moving out of the city, there isn't going to be any home for the wildlife or wilderness if we all move out of the city. So I'm willing to sacrifice my life myself. I'm just fortunate that in a way, at least it's only these criminals that are threatening me like that. We don't have the threats that some environmentalists have, as I'm sure you're well aware, the Nigerian environmentalist who was a recipient of numerous international honors, who was hanged by his government for his environmental work. I have a friend talking about poetry earlier, a lawyer, environmental poet from Malaysia who has been under house arrest, and when I went to Malaysia, I couldn't even look him up. I mean, people are doing struggling a lot more. You read the stories of the scientists and biologists out there in the field and what they have to go through with the local people, and I commend them. And we definitely need to give the support, both to us documenting those stories, which is a challenge in and of itself, and to the people who are doing those researches. But the problem is these battles go on over an extended period of time. Public hearings, lawsuits, protests, they go on for years, they go on for decades. Most media only want to cover it once or twice. And it's too late then for public action by the time the media comes and says a decision was made today. I mean, these decisions, participating in that horrible environmental impact statement, environmental impact report, environmental impact assessment review process is a boring process, and it takes a long time, and it's certainly not an exciting one to present in a film. But somehow we need to draw attention to these issues on a constant, regular basis. The trick is to give an area or a species the needed attention over and over again so that the public can respond. You know, the public has gotten the feel and the belief that rainforests must be saved, particularly in the United States. It's very easy for people to go, save the rainforest. But yet in Southern California, just in the city of Los Angeles, we have the largest oak forest in Sunshine Canyon left, and that shows the whole grassland oak ecosystem. And they want to put a dump. And Ellesmere Canyon, one of the few remaining in Angeles National Forest, right in the northwest of Los Angeles, is proposed for the largest solid waste landfill in the country. And these are areas that people don't know about, because for me to get in and look at it, I'm being taped, I'll say it I'll go on public record. I trespassed. I had to be able to see this area and to be able to know what the problem was. I had to go out for my early morning run and hike, and I just got lost, actually, right? I mean, somebody directed me, said, go that direction, you'll see some interesting oak trees. I really didn't know where I was, but I discovered the most beautiful habitat, the most beautiful ecosystems. If the public doesn't see those ecosystems, why are they going to save it? I commend somebody like David Brower, who, with his picture format books, he was the first to create those, who documented on film places like Grand Canyon and Glen Canyon that were threatened with dams and many other places. If he didn't bring some of those sites to the public's attention by pictures, we wouldn't have them. Ansel Adams, and go back further. I mean, look at the writings of our nature writers. Look at John Muir, one of our founding fathers of the environmental movement. They wrote about the places, Yosemite, that needed to be saved. Of course, John Muir lost also. I mean, they died over losing Hetch Hetchy, which was an equivalent Yosemite. People couldn't get there, enough people to see it. And we know that when people see the wildlife, when they see the areas, they're going to do something about it. So we have an important role in this kind of work. Clayoquot Sound in British Columbia, Ward Valley in California, where they're proposing a large low-level radioactive waste dump. Headwaters Forest in Northern California, an ancient redwood forest, the largest tract left of such a rainwood forest. These, unfortunately, are not household words like tropical rainforest. And what's amazing to me is I went up last summer to the Clayoquot Forest to do that story, to the sound, and hundreds of people were getting arrested in British Columbia. Out of Ward Valley, people were getting arrested. Headwaters Forest, they're getting arrested. But the media considers this a local story. it's covered on the front page of the local newspaper, but did the LA Times, the New York Times, did the Missoula, Montana papers cover these arrests? I mean, we have environmentalists willing to get arrested, and yet you don't hear about it on the news, and yet coming to this event, you know, my plane was packed full of people ready to go and cover, you know, an arrest of the Unabomber. Well, of course, that person's done some awful things, and it deserves media coverage, but why didn't we have these carloads of media going where people are putting down their lives, they're literally putting their bodies on the line for the wildlife? I mean, we have to change the attitude somehow. You know, to tell these kinds of stories, the problem, as we were discussing in some workshops earlier, is that of funding. And to get the funding, we have to challenge our principles. If you tell the story of a large corporation that will destroy an area by mining or oil drilling or other exploitative development, will you get those needed dollars? I just interviewed someone yesterday, a professor, who indicated he didn't get some of those research grant dollars when he came out and talked about the damage of nuclear testing on the people, the downwinders in Utah in the 50s, as well as the wildlife that had to be affected, that nobody's really ever still documented to this day. I mean, somebody has to be willing to stand up and not necessarily get those dollars. I encourage you, I give you my support, as I have, to keep on fighting to preserve your integrity. And hopefully, as they say, you and I will at least sleep better. Hopefully we'll sleep better, albeit a little poorer and a little hungrier. You know, I'm reminded of another story of a man who was going through the booming oil fields of southern Oklahoma, and he saw somebody gave a man a lift on his way to the county seat, and the two were driving along some of these this beautiful farmland that's now scarred by bulldozers and drilling rigs and cluttered with all sorts of pumps and storage tanks, and he would guess that his passenger was a farmer living in the area, and so the driver, you know, started moving the conversation in the direction of these these tall tales of quick, rich schemes that the speculators and the farmers were getting rich very fast from this. So the local man acknowledged that these stories were actually founded on fact. The guy asked, well, you own a farm here? Yeah, I own one. Any oil wells on it? Oh, yeah, I've got 3 good ones, and they say there's 300 barrels a day. And what in the world are you going to do with all that money you're getting? And the farmer, he looked around for a moment, and he gazed, and he looked across this machine-scarred field, and he answered, why, I'm going to buy me a farm that ain't got any oil wells on it. He knew what he had lost. Is it really the money that's at stake? If we lose our wildlife, we're losing a lot more. Let's help create a new morality, an enlightened and noble view of humanity's role in nature, one not of always conquering nature. The framers of our Constitution did not delineate what I consider 2 important rights. And I can speak as a framer. I'm a descendant of some of the signers of the Constitution and people like Thomas Jefferson, who actually wrote the Constitution. And I wish I'd been around to talk with him at the time, because I would have told him that he needed to indicate the right to a quality environment and the right for all species to survive. Now, they probably simply didn't deem it necessary at the time to delineate those rights. It was just, it understood that those rights existed. Today, the quest for a quality environment with all species evolving at a natural rate without human interruption is more than a right. It is a crucial obligation. As anthropologist Margaret Mead commented, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And I certainly believe that the 19th International Wildlife Film Festival will have the impact to spread around the world, and the group here can make that change. Regardless of one's religious, cultural, or other differences, we must rethink our political, economic, and sociological structures so as to develop a united Earth based on bioregionalism. Totally different concept. I wish Thomas Jefferson and all his gang were here today to do a little rewriting that we so desperately need. We have to consider ecological principles. We have to consider all of life on this Mother Earth. We have to stop the population explosion that is putting the demands on wildlife and their habitat. Do you realize that over 83 million people are being added to the planet every single year? That figure equals to 7,225,000 births every month, 1,667,000 every week, 238,000 every day, 9,900 every hour, 164 every minute, and 2.7 every second. I've yet to see a 0.7 child, but you know, that's the way statistics are. You have to take them or leave them, but someplace around there. I did some math last night on that, and I thought about it. I said, the problem is, again, how do we get these figures so we can visualize it? Well, my math's not as perfect as the scientists who come up with 2.7 children, but I did figure it out that in 3 years, the number of people that we have adding to the population on this planet every year would mean that in 3 years, we would have to take care of the same number of people that are in the United States today. Now, we all know that we aren't providing the social services, schools, education, police, fire, sewage systems, you name it, to make a quality environment that we have now. We don't have everything that we would like now. We are not taking care of the over 260 million people in the United States today, and yet we're adding that equivalent number of people on this planet every 3 years. Where and how are we going to take care of them? We're the wealthiest country in the world, and we're not doing it. Those human numbers put pressures, as you well know, on wildlife, which means that within 10 years, we may not be losing just 5 species per day, as we are now, but 5 species per hour. By the year 2000, at the current rate, 20% of all Earth species will be lost forever. You know how important these species are to the rich cornucopia of medicines, industrial uses, agricultural benefits. The solutions do exist. This is what's amazing. We simply are not far-sighted enough to start implementing them now. As I tell the oil companies, why not invest in alternative technologies now while we still need oil and we have some oil left? Why wait until it's all gone? Same thing I tell to the logging companies. Why not invest in other ways? In other words, our ancient forests don't have to be cut. The handful that are left, they could be preserved if we switch not just to recycled paper, which has become real popular, but remember, recycled paper still originally had a virgin tree cut down, and it still had trees being recycled. What we need is tree-free paper, and we have it, KNAF. And going back to that wonderful mainstay, hemp. You know what our Constitution was written on? Hemp. Yes, that wonderful plant where there are over 2,000 products that can be made from it, aside from the joints for smoking it. Oh, which has some uses too. Now, solar technology is viable today. We don't have to wait for the future. Integrated pest management allows for farming without hazardous insecticides and pesticides. Ecotourism is becoming a popular way to help conserve wildlife. If it's true ecotourism, if it's just the same old package tour and they say it's ecotourism because they're looking at wildlife, don't buy into it. You know, ecotourism truly means putting money back into the local economy, the local people, putting money back into conservation, habitat, and programs, and helping the local people. When I travel as an ecotourist, and I do it often, I clear out and have my friends clear out their medicine cabinets. I mean, an aspirin to us is nothing. It costs, you know, $1, you know, for a handful of aspirin. And in some of these rural medical clinics, that is like giving them penicillin. I mean, it is so valuable. We clear out our medicines. I take it down. I clear out my bookshelf. I clear out my clothes. And I take as the limit I possibly can on the plane of weight, so that I can distribute these things, so that people know that I'm not coming down to take advantage of them, I'm coming down to give to them. And so stop traveling lightly, people. A real ecotourist has more suitcases than you know what to do with. And I'm sure, of course, I could go on, but I'm going to run out of time, and the tape's going to run out if I don't watch out here. Now, I think I still have a few minutes left. There are hundreds of books now on the market. When I started environmental activism in the 1970s, there were one bookshelf for the 70s of ecological books. And now I get a bookshelf a week of ecological books. So you can read about all the wonderful ways. You didn't come here to have me tell you how to live ecologically, but I know you know how, and I know that you're doing the best you can. You know, I'm reminded of a story of a backpacking friend who told me of a time not too long ago when two young men were hiking across an alpine meadow in the Alaskan tundra, and they spotted one of these big, I've got to be careful, I know there's some bear experts here. Apparently up there in the Alaskan tundra where I haven't backpacked, they're huge silverback grizzly bears. And they came across one about 200 yards away, and one hiker was puzzled when the other bent down and started changing his shoes. And he said, you know, well, what are you doing? You can't outrun that grizzly. And the hiker replied, no, but I can outrun you. So, too many people, unfortunately, are thinking only of their survival. The short-sightedness of such an attitude paves the way for the destruction of all who follow. As Eleanor Roosevelt observed, perhaps nature is our best assurance of immortality. Let's keep with what we have left and be proper stewards of all of the Earth's resources. When I was a college student, I was concerned about wildlife and wilderness. I hadn't really gotten into running and backpacking, but I just knew that it had to be there. And even if I hadn't seen it, I wanted to do something. And so I thought, well, there are thousands of species out there, and they're the groups to protect the big ones. So I went down the list of Southern California species, and I said, well, who's protecting? I had to learn Latin, Cyprinodon diabolus. Anybody know what I'm talking about? It's the little devil's hole pupfish. There are only about 300 individuals left. They were only found in one water spring called Devil's Hole. It's now part of the Death Valley National Park, which used to be a monument, but even then it wasn't even part of too much protected. And some cattle rancher wanted to pump some water, which was pulling the water level out of the hole, and there goes the last. The pupfish were really interesting species. I'm not a fisherman. I don't understand fish. But somehow I just said, this species needs somebody to draw attention to it, so I became president of Save Our Pupfish. And I'd never seen the pupfish, even when I became president of it. Eventually I went out and saw them. But it shows that you can do that. You don't have to be an expert. And I always maintained that even though I wasn't a biologist, I could still care about a species and do it. I started another petition then too, because I realized with the habitat destruction in California, we have over 95% of all our estuaries and wetlands along the coast gone, destroyed totally. So I started a petition to help have research for the government to develop the non-stop goose, the one who could fly, you know, from Canada to Mexico and bypass the western coast where there are no wetlands for them to stop off at. I mean, people took me seriously. I mean, that's how much they believed in technology. I mean, I was trying to make a point that, you know, maybe this non-stop goose can't really be developed, and we better preserve their habitat. I'm reminded of another incident of Dr. Noel Brown. He just retired as the executive director of the North American program for the United Nations Environment Program. And he recounted a story of one of the first situations where the United Nations was asked to provide safe conduct over a war zone. For what? What do you think they provided safe conduct for? Whooping cranes. Now, these endangered birds spend winter and summer, as many migrating birds of that nature do, on in different places, in this case different continents, and they had to fly over warring nations like Iran and Iraq and some of those. And I think it was a great act of mankind that we had someone concerned enough to ask for the United Nations help in protecting them on that flight. And we really need to ask for help from everyone for all our wildlife. To some people, the earth is being called Gaia. It's a living organism. To others, it's a living spaceship. But regardless of how you want to view it, if you just want to view it as your home and place where you're growing up and eating and sleeping and having your fun, it's a place that must be self-sustaining. It's a place that creatures as well as humans